The world is in a huge crisis of meaning, and our collective meaning-making structures are gone. AI, Epstein files, the complete farce of international law becoming ever more clear day by day. People don't know what is true anymore, and this will continue for quite a while ahead. This corresponds astrologically perfectly with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that we had in the middle of February on the very first degree of the entire zodiac, 0 degrees of Aries, which is the cosmic alpha point of creation itself. Saturn's and Neptune's cycle takes 37 years and is in and of itself not that monumentous, even though it always corresponds to major historical events. But the fact that it happened on 0 degrees of the zodiac, the really true beginning of where and how human consciousness comes into manifestation, implies that the cycle we're living through is so much deeper, so much bigger than what most of us can fathom up until now. People don't know what is real anymore, and thus also project meaning or look and long for and yearn for meaning in whatever they can find, which also leads to an immense sense of disillusionment and delusion. Disillusionment, though, is of course a positive process, even though it's very confusing or painful in its unfolding, because it's an end of old illusions. Saturn corresponds to structures, inner and outer structures. We externalize Saturn a lot through government. And it's interesting, of course, that government, from the Latin to govern and ment, like the mind, comes from to rule the mind, right? So we project Saturn and outer structures and try to create outer structures in our social world through the Saturn function. But Neptune dissolves. Neptune makes everything foggy and dissipates whatever energy it touches. So Saturn's Neptune conjunction corresponds so much to where and how old structures, old systems, internally and externally, are falling apart, are being washed away. Neptune's function is not just, though, about washing things away, but it is about pointing things back to deeper truth. And on the deepest level of truth, the deepest side of Neptune, of our own consciousness, we must realize that everything is one and everything is connected. That is the deep spiritual impulse that Neptune implies. How we externalize that is through institutionalizing the spiritual impulse through religion, first and foremost. And here we also see the complete collapse of what people still believe in or don't believe in anymore. At the same time, though, of course, trying to cling ever more strongly to old religious structures that have given a sense of stability to humanity for a long time. So we both see this complete lack of belief and people becoming ever more confused because of this, but also the counter impulse of trying to hold on to old, maybe rigid or commanding, that's the Saturn, the judging, obeying kind of law of religious impulses or religious structures that we have institutionalized. But of course also on the world stage, governments, world law, international law, showing its true face, that it's all just a farce. This corresponds so much, of course, also to what happened with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, one of the things that happened here, which is the release of the Epstein files, and at least one big part of humanity really waking up to who and what actually holds power and structure and control here on the deeper level of reality. The friends of Epstein and their black magic rituals that try to control reality, the friends of Mossad and CIA that through the shadows have been steering and guiding and manipulating human consciousness and society for decades, if not centuries. Yet falling into the trap of the whole conspiratorial thinking, the black pill, it's like, oh, you got to awaken to all the things that are wrong in society, in the matrix. Sure, that is good in many ways, but it also leads many people astray. Everything is suddenly a conspiracy. Nothing can be taken at face value anymore. Do I think that many of the things that are happening on the world stage are more or less scripted or staged or not what they really seem to be? Yeah, for sure. But do I think that everything is a conspiracy and that nothing can be trusted? No, also not. But that is also one of the traps, because where and how people fall into that kind of thinking as if that is a true impulse of awakening, and that this will again give a sense of structure or stability because I am in the known and I've seen through this. Yes, it's important that we see through all of these spider webs of lies and deceit and illusion that have been spun over our collective eyes for decades and centuries. But is that why we're really here? Is this why you're awakened? Because you see through XYZ hot topic going on at the moment? No. Neptune wants to point us to our own inner connection to spirit, to nature, to source, to our own heart, whatever name you want to give it, whatever kind of society or religious view you're coming from, the impulse, the direction is always the same. And this is why we're really here as human beings, to awaken on that kind of level. Call it Christ consciousness, call it the Buddha mind, or just call it awakening to love and compassion and forgiveness and kindness for each other, to stop fighting and engaging in this non-stop externalization of the boogeyman out there, which again is just, of course, being used by the powers that be through the divide and conquer. The other side where we will see this tendency pick up even more so, though, is because Uranus is now fully in Gemini. And Gemini is the sign of duality par excellence. With Gemini, though, we want to learn to really listen, to engage with other perspectives, to open and broaden and, yeah, awaken our mind. Uranus is this impulse of true liberation and awakening, but it can be disruptive. It can be confronting, but it can also become quite dogmatic. And the shadow of Gemini is, of course, the black and white thinking, the polarity. It's either this way or that way. Whereas the truth of Gemini just shows us everything in life has a dual nature, but in between are a million gradients of gray or color, whatever name you give it. And that there is no truth to be found as long as we stay stuck in polarity and duality. And while we do so, we are just so much more easily manipulated by the powers that be again and pitted against each other instead of really finding our common humanity and seeing that we're all one human family. We're all one humanity. There are no true sides, ultimately. AI being, of course, and technology itself, the other big topic there. Uranus and all of this new novel energy will bring so much technology much faster than even the last 20 years, which is kind of scary, to be honest. Like, I'm glad I still grew up without smartphones and without the internet, that I still lived an analog life for a moment. But the technological impulse will become faster than ever before. And this will, of course, be seen by many to be the solution, the thing that really helps humanity evolve. But that's not true as well. That just keeps us locked in our minds, dissociated from our body, dissociated from nature, and thinking that through technological domineering of nature and nature around us, but also even our own inner nature, that we can regain a sense of stability within, which is also an illusion. And like I said, just leads to more and more dissociation. With AI, we of course also see this greater and greater confusion of what is even real. We can't tell reality by looking at our screens anymore. We need the Gemini, we need the true human encounter more and more and more again if you really want to meet something genuine and honest and real. At the same time, though, the delusion and confusion where people project consciousness, Neptune is consciousness itself, into these algorithmic processes, right? ChatGPT doesn't know anything. It mimics language and it mimics knowledge, but it's not true knowledge, and it's also not true communication, and it's also not wisdom to be found there. It will always just be a shallow mimicry of true human intelligence. And yet many people are already getting lost in this kind of rabbit hole, right? Also, of course, the disconnection from our own humanity, but in that way also from our brothers and sisters and humanity at large, where we need the engagement with like, oh, with ChatGPT, I can always talk, I can always share, it's always going to be approving of me, you know? Just leading to even more delusion and even more confusion. What I see going on is so much that astrologically we are meant to dream up new mythologies, dream up new ways of how we find meaning in the world. And because the Saturn-Neptune cycle began at the first degree of the entire zodiac, it's a much, much, much more important cycle than it was for the last 2,500 years, repeating every 37 years. Yes, the last time it was in '89, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. It completely shifted the power dynamics on the world stage. And it did so with every previous conjunction at its cycle as well. But the fact that this cycle happened on the very first degree of the zodiac, like it hasn't happened since 2,500 years, which is when what quite a few historians are calling the axial age. 500 BC, around 500 BC, we saw this huge sudden rise in civilizational technology. Democracy was invented, and now we see maybe that dream has dreamt itself up. We need to find a new way of how to engage with it or revive it in a way that actually really embodies the ideals that were set into motion 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. We also saw the birth of the Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama, becoming the Buddha and thus creating Buddhism. In China, there was Lao Tzu and Confucius. Ancient Egypt still had a high time at that moment as well. And what we're living through right now, this collapse of meaning, the crisis on consciousness that is unfolding right now, which I would say is really a crisis in how we find meaning in the world, shows us our old stories and mythologies are over. Capitalism, individuality, even the patriarchal last 2,500 years that we basically lived from that time period onwards, the end of matriarchal lines and this rise of patriarchal consciousness and patriarchal deities and religions. Right? All of these stories have served their time. Holding on to what is old to regain a sense of stability is not the way forward. But neither is it to just say it's all for nothing and there is no wisdom to be found there. No, we need to find up and dream up a new future. But this also brings us back to the other side of Saturn. Saturn corresponding to authority and structure. And the Saturn cycle with Neptune beginning again here in Aries talks so much about how we need to find our own inner authority, how externalizing it to the powers that be outward is just not going to cut it anymore, at least not for most people. The ones that try to do so will, of course, just be subjected to their funny games, on and on and on. But no, we need to find our own inner authority and align with deeper structures that are truly Neptune, timeless, that can't change. The rising and falling of the sun and the moon every day, every night, every month, realigning with the natural cycles of our body and the cosmic nature all around us can give us the sense of stability that we might feel like we're lacking as long as we look outward into the craziness of what the F is even still going on in society. While at the same time also learning to embody the Neptune impulse like never before. Kindness, compassion, forgiveness, seeing the unity behind all the different faces and colors and whatever names that we give God, and seeing that ultimately we are all one and one human family, and how we deepen our own spiritual, creative individuation process in our own psyche is this deepest Neptune impulse. This is true awakening, not realizing that 9/11 was an inside job or the Trump assassination attempt a couple of days ago was completely staged. Yeah, sure. But how does that serve you and me in our common day? In how we deal with our friends and neighbors and lovers and family, how we bring our creative gifts into the world. We can get so lost in these kinds of rabbit holes which I see so many people doing right now. But that's not going to serve us either. That's not going to help us dream up the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, like Charles Eisenstein says so beautifully. There's, of course, also the theory of the fourth turning that maybe many people have, by now would have heard about, which also says we are now in a time of crises. But anybody who knows a bit more about astrology also knows that the fourth turning 84-year cycle corresponds perfectly to the cycle of Uranus, who also takes 84 years. And Uranus, every time it is in Gemini, the USA are in a major conflict. Civil war, independence war, and the Second World War last time. So with this, we can also see when how all of these twisted things that are happening with the Iran war, the Minister of War, Pete Hegseth, talking about the erection of the third temple, right? Also there, the delusion and confusion of the religious power structures of trying to create an Armageddon, trying to force the returning of Christ or whatever in their deluded minds they're thinking, right? How we see it playing out on that level. And yes, it's also important to wake up to that kind of web of lies and deception and confusion that is being spun there, because it will pull a big chunk of humanity into its grip. But again, this is not going to help us in our own personal daily life of how we learn to live as better human beings and actually care for one another and care for our body, care for this body of earth. So this crisis of consciousness will continue, this crisis of meaning that we're collectively in. As long as we try to hold on to these external power structures, we just will continue to feel this sense of erosion and confusion and overwhelm, and the Piscean Neptune processes swamping us, right? This flood wave that is like taking us. No, the inner practice of how we actually make sense of the world in our own spiritual worldview and not getting lost in whatever else is being spoon-fed to us by the algorithm, right? That's the way to go. So I hope you're keeping sane out there and that this insight maybe gave you a little bit. Where you have Aries in your chart, the house ruled by Aries, so where you have Saturn and Neptune in, and also where you have Gemini, and thus Uranus having just recently, the last couple of days, entered Gemini, are the two areas of your own life, of your own personal chart that get the most activated with this process, where and how you might struggle or learn and grow through these kinds of energies the most. So look at your own personal birth chart for that. And yeah, hope you're keeping sane. See you soon. Bye-bye.